First things first, take the bolt out that holds the keel into the bottom of the sailboat. Then remove the keel from the bottom of the sailboat. This is easier said than done. I had to build a special cradle to hold my keel out of a piece of plywood, some 4x4s, a couple of 2x4s, and a moving dolly. The cradle you can see in this picture. And you can see the reason I removed the keel. The damage up where the bolt went through the keel into the hull of the boat. The work that's going to be done today is to repair this crack in the keel. This crack, as you can see, has allowed water to seep into the iron bar that runs down the length of the keel from top to bottom, supplying the bulbous lead weight at the bottom with the strength that it needs to keep the sailboat from flipping over in heavy winds. This crack, in allowing the water to seep in, has given the iron the ability to expand with the rust. That expansion can later on cause much more damage to the underside of my boat, keeping the keel from swinging up and down, causing the keel to completely rust out and fall out of the boat, thereby losing my stability on the water. Many different things can happen with this kind of a crack. So what I need to do is I need to sand away the entire surface space. In fact, in this particular area, you can see where my fingers are. The bulb that starts where this delamination of the fiberglass and the iron underneath have begun and grown. That's hollow, that's solid, all the way down and around the eye hole where the bolt sticks through the bottom of the boat into the keel and keeps it at a pivot point. I also need to cut and clean this area above the bolt hole where the pivot point is, slightly further than, again you can see the separation here in the fiberglass, slightly further than the pivot bolt, so that I can get all of the broken fiberglass out, repair the entire side, just as far down as this crack here on this side, because most likely the entire piece of fiberglass and bondo and resin that sits on top of the iron chunk is junk. I need to remove that, replace it all with more bondo, more resin, more fiberglass, reseal the whole thing, and at that point I can place it back in my boat and go sailing again. This is a fairly substantial job, so this is the repair I'm doing today. This is what I'm going to show you how to do fiberglass work on the keel of a 1966 MacGregor Venture 21-foot sailboat. Let me quickly go over a list of the tools that I have at hand. One is a set of calipers. That gives me the depth and the distance that I can actually allow the fiberglass, the resin, the bondo, and the iron to grow when I'm doing my repairs on the keel, so that I can still get it back in the same hole that I pulled it out of. That hole is a specific width, and if I don't have that width, if I'm too wide on the end of my keel, it won't fit. If I'm too shallow on the end of my keel, I'll have the same problem that I have just experienced with the crack and the failed fiberglass. So some of the tools that are necessary are the calipers, a pair of gloves. You don't want to get fiberglass all over your hands. Eye protection. Always wear eye protection when working with fiberglass. Those shards will ruin your eyesight. Hearing protection, because I'm using a compressor with compressed air tools. Those are my sanding devices. Two different sets of face shields. One is a chemical protectant full respirator, so that I can work with the fiberglass and the resin without inhaling all of that resin exhaust. And the other is just your normal dust mask. I will probably wear the full face mask and respirator the entire time, just because even the dust mask doesn't keep the fiberglass shards completely out of my lungs. I have a home-built setup holding this keel, which weighs roughly 300 pounds off of the ground. It's a piano dolly on two 2 by 6 by 16 cinder blocks with on top of that a straight sheet of plywood and a home-built cradle that keeps the keel facing the direction that I want it to face for easy reinstallation and easy removal from the boat itself. Otherwise, how are you supposed to keep this long, thin piece of fiberglass and metal from falling over sideways when you want to put it up inside the bottom of the boat? As you can see, I've already cut a large portion of the chunk fiberglass and bondo material off of the top, and I'm cutting down into the delaminated portion of the fiberglass with a thin layer of bondo in between the fiberglass outer shell and the iron bar in the keel itself. First, I need to remove the delaminated material as much as possible. In doing this, that allows me the freedom to clean, clear, and make a scratch coat for the new layer of bondo and the new fiberglass to adhere to. It's important to get all of the delamination off. Any suspect areas need to be cut away and cleared. I have to chip this segment out because my goal was not to dig too much material off of the keel, but to see where the delamination actually took place. Okay, now at this point I'm going to sand the actual iron down. You can see the bar of iron that runs through this keel. I need to do that to open up new, fresh, rough, porous material that'll allow the new fiberglass that I attach to this iron to stick better. This rusted flakiness will cause whatever fiberglass I put on there, if I don't do this particular process, to delaminate even more, and that crack will return instantly. Quite a bit of integrity, so I had to go with an electric angle grinder to clear off more material at a quicker pace and get the project moving along faster. You've got to be careful using an angle grinder. It does remove a lot of material, and it looks like I'm removing too much material, but my goal here was to completely remove any of the delamination. That's the most important thing on a fiberglass repair, especially to anything in a metal sense or any other non-fiberglass substrate. I had to clear away any delamination and make it so that everything that I was attaching to was completely attached already. And at that point, then I could start the fiberglass touch-up, which would be to sand around the outside edge of the fiberglass, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Okay, before we go too much further, I need to calibrate the width that I have at my original pivot bolt, because at this particular width, this is as wide as I was able to get the fiberglass, the metal, the bondo, everything that is this keel up into the hole that goes into the boat. What I'm doing here is I'm sanding a good portion around the exterior of my repair. That'll give me enough substrate to attach to the new fiberglass with the old fiberglass and all of the matting that I'm going to put in there. I need at least 2 inches of rough material around my repair work so that I can give that good solid bond that will then adhere to the metal and last forever. A new sandpaper pad will do much quicker work than an old pad. These are some still photographs of the work that I did. You can see the large area of roughed up fiberglass on the outskirts of the repair cutting. You can see the best that I could do with both the angle grinder, the air grinder, and the DA sander at cleaning off the iron itself. And you can still see that there's some delamination up where the bolt hole is, and I'll address that again in a little bit. Okay, now you can see that I've done all of the repairs. I've dug myself about a 2-inch scratch gap between the actual repair area, the metal, and the good fiberglass that doesn't need to be repaired. Partially, that gives me a depth to build fiberglass and bondo out to the original layer. It also provides me with the strength and the rigidity of the new fiberglass to attach and adhere to the old fiberglass with a solid sealed bond. I've done a little bit more cleaning around the pivot bolt area on both sides because it looked like it was still flaking quite a bit there. This was pretty well adhered to the iron, so I left it there. That gives me a base to come to other than the iron, which is always a little better. But the iron is going to have to suffice for the rest of it. As you can see, again, 2-inch barrier all the way around of rough stuff. The next segment is going to be the addition of some bondo to bring up especially this area here. You can see it's about 1.5 inches low there to about 2.5 inches here. I need to build out the width of the iron and build up the height of the fiberglass with a little bit of bondo. I am going to do a very thin coat of bondo on the outside of the iron on either side, this side and this side. But the top needs a decent sized coat of bondo. As you can see when you're looking at the layers from this side, your fiberglass is a thin coat on either outside. Inside is a resin-based fiber bondo that built up the solid and beefy part outside of the iron. We're going to build that same bondo all the way across, connected. Have to do quite a bit more sanding, and then come back and lay up our first layer of fiberglass. Here's a look at the tools that I'm going to be using for the bondo process. You want a fiberglass filled bondo that comes with a separate hardener. You need a paint can opener, a regular putty knife to do the mixing with, a soft putty knife to do the spreading with. Again, the chemical mask, this time you'll see me use it. The reason I didn't use it in the sanding process was the heat causes so much sweat that the mask would have just been horribly uncomfortable. So I used the particle mask at first. Because this is a chemical and an actual smell, there are vapors, and this is a chemically reducing mask. I'm going to use the chemical mask rather than the particle mask because a particle mask has no effect against chemicals. Also a can of acetone for the cleanup and the finalized process. I use an old piece of car window. You can use anything you want, but a nice smooth surface for not only mixing of your hardener and your resin, but also easy cleanup with your putty knife on a smooth surface so that you can come back and reuse this same surface many times. This has been in my family now. My father used it when he was doing bondo work on antique and classic cars 30-40 years ago. So this has been in the family for a long time. A good smooth surface is a great benefit. I have to admit that I, for some reason, either lost the footage or did not film the actual bondo part of this project. So I'll explain it in words while you watch me do some sanding. Same kind of sanding as I did with the actual metal and outer fiberglass layers. The difference here is that it's a lighter touch sanding. I'm using the DA sander because it doesn't take off as much material in one time. First though, let's talk about the actual application of the bondo. Bondo is bondo. You can get it for cars, you can get it for anything, but what I was using was a fiberglass infused bondo that took the same hardener as a normal bondo, about 2 inches of the hardener, which is a red liquid substance, put on top of a big dollop from your putty knife that you use. 2 inches of that hardener will mix in and give you enough working time to get a large dollop spread out as best you can. When you start noticing that the bondo is physically moving with the putty knife and not smoothing out anymore, that's when you're done. The bondo is pretty much dry. If you continue, you're just going to cause more and more bubbles, and bubbles are bad in this situation. You want to have the least amount of bubbles, the most amount of smooth surface, so that you don't have to rebondo too much. Now, I mentioned before using the DA sander takes off less material. I had to get in with the angle grinder, the angle air grinder, a little bit because there were some segments that the material was so thick I actually had to cut it out. And this does the cutting in a smooth way. You probably want to run just a heavier grit sandpaper with your DA sander rather than using the angle grinder. I've had years of experience with the angle grinder, so I know what I'm doing with it. It's like using a hand sander or a belt sander with wood. In this same instance, if you came at it with a belt sander, you'd grind holes or grind grooves into your work. Well, if you know how to use a belt sander, you could make it smooth. For me, the angle grinder was the tool to make it smooth in a quicker fashion and to get through the top layer so that I could lay up one more and thicken the repair just a little bit more. For you, I would recommend continuing with the DA sander and doing so with maybe a 60 grit rather than the 80 grit, or an 80 grit if you were using a 120 grit. You saw in the end there that I ended up using the DA sander again. I used the DA sander at the end after I've done the angle grinder to smooth out the grinding marks so that any portion of the resin that's coming from the fiberglass that actually touches the repair isn't affected by the grinder marks. It's a smoother repair. So at this juncture, you can see that I'm finished with my sanding. I've cleaned off both sides. I still have a few little places that are lower than others, but again, filling with the fiberglass. This is the non-woven. This is the mesh. The splinters of fiberglass just all over the place. This is a piece that's about 2 by 2 square roughly. I'm going to take this square piece, lay it over my patch size, and measure for cutting visually. When I cut this piece, I actually want to cut it somewhat smaller than the repair needs, so that I can take and fray out the sides. You can see, you can't really see well, but you can see the indentation of the dark coloring underneath the fiberglass mesh. So I can cut it slightly smaller than the dark coloring on the mesh, trying not to allow my mesh to touch the ground. All of this excess is reusable for either filler or for patchwork elsewhere and smaller patching needs. I'll do the exact same thing, roughly the size. It doesn't have to be perfect. On the opposite side. Okay, so with a normal pair of scissors, I've cut my patch. It's just on the inside of that set of lines and pretty close to the inside of this set of lines. The next piece of work is to fray all of the edges. That makes the material thinner and gives it a gradient blend into the original piece that you're working with. To do that, I'm going to take and lay down a piece of plastic. Okay, the reason I've laid down my piece of plastic is so that I can easily take the shards and fray the edges. I'm not trying to take too much material off, just enough so that there's thinner edges. All of the excess fraying I keep on a clean piece of plastic off of the ground so that later on I can use that as filler material for larger gaps, any kind of dips. This material is pretty thick. You can actually take and individually pull out several layers if you're only doing smaller repair jobs, or if you wish for a thinner cover. But in this case, I'm looking for strength and I'm looking for bulk. One more time, the reason I'm doing this is so that the edges can smoothly transition themselves into the original piece, rather than having a big, sharp cut, hard edge that's harsh and causes unnecessary sanding. So now my edges should easily, with the resin, blend right into the older fiberglass, the non-necessary repair. Then my sanding will come off smoother, and the next layer that comes on will do the same, slightly smaller than this level. Each layer goes on slightly smaller, and at the end then we put the woven cloth over the whole thing and we cut it at a much bigger patch and then blend that in by sanding. Please don't mind my father and I's dirty garage. We happen to be project people whom often, when we start a project, don't finish it, and very seldom do we finish cleaning up after ourselves. Another project will just come in hand, and there we go. At this point, I am going to begin the resin mixing for the fiberglass application of that matted fiberglass material. So resin is a lot different than bondo. With the resin, you are susceptible to stickiness. I recommend using rubber gloves when working with resin. My only problem is I don't have any rubber gloves at this time. I look inside my lid and I see that my resin has held itself well. I'm not losing resin because of any kind of chunkage or crystallization. Old resin, when it sat and been open to the oxygen and the open air, if it's sat long enough, it'll crystallize, and that means that the resin itself is no longer good. It won't cure. Even with your hardener, you can put as much as you want in there, and the curing will be sticky, and the quality of the repair will be much worse. So, now that we see that my resin is good, I am going to take, actually I don't need that big of a mixing bin. I'm going to take my resin mixing cup. Make sure that your resin mixing cup doesn't have anything that you don't want to see in your fiberglass or any oils in it. It needs to be as clean as possible. This was a resin mixing cup that I used for another fiberglass job before, so in all cases this is a fine cup for me. A good new one for you, simple, $1.25 at the hardware store, will ensure perfect bondage. I pour in a generous amount of resin for what I need, because in this particular case that's a pretty big fiberglass patch. In fact, even this amount at 150 milliliters or 4 ounces, that's not quite enough. I'm going to have to pour in a little bit more and give myself about 6 ounces total if I'm going to be able to cover that large patch area and get the submersion of the resin through the woven material. That woven material is pretty thick. Use a brush to return any excess resin in the lid of your can. If you're not using a can but the regular hardware store bottle, just be careful to keep your top area clean. It makes for an easier opening next time you go for the resin for another fiberglass project, or for a continued application of more fiberglass on the patch that you're presently working on. So now I've got around 6 ounces of fluid, of resin. With my catalyst, for a small segment of resin, you're looking at a small bottle of catalyst, which you'll get with your hardware store resin. You're looking to drop a total of 6 to 10 drops, like an eyedropper drops. When I have this much resin, totaling at about 6 ounces, I'm going to take from that 6 to 10 drops and I'm going to add, I would say 15 drops. 15 drops will give me adequate time to complete the project while allowing the resin to cure slowly enough so that it doesn't harden up in the cup. I take my 15 drops, which I have just eyeballed, mix it very well. You want it to completely blend. Remove any of the excess. Again, it is a messy job. You're trying your best not to make a mess. Grab your brush, get your brush inundated with the resin. Then go outside and start the process before your resin hardens. Okay, so now you see that I'm outside. I still have my plastic underneath the piece of fiberglass just in case before I get to it, it blows off. I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to brush on resin over the patch area before I actually lay down my fiberglass. This will ensure that the fiberglass sticks to the patch repair area and that resin did permeate the underside. You'll see as we continue that you'll have to push resin through this woven mat. It is some pretty thick stuff. I'll add the second layer as I'm starting to apply my fiberglass. You're going to get drips. There's no perfection in this particular part of the glassing process. It's messy as heck. I apply the outside edges first and then work my way to the center. That helps with the final squeeze. There's a tool that I'll use in a moment that I'll roll over this particular fiberglass webbing that will help push the resin throughout the glass better than the brush is doing presently. This is just a temporary, hey, I got to get it on here and move to the other side. I'll apply the same process to the other side. First, adding resin to the patch area before I lay the glass down on it. Getting all the way around my repair section. Now that I've done that, I'm going to send a little bit across the ridge. You really want that ridge to stick. And glass the ridge. I work on the ridge on this side first because the ridge is important to soak. If it's soaking and it has time to soak, you won't have air bubbles. If it doesn't have time to soak, you may have air bubbles in it. When you're sanding, all you're going to end up doing is having to and wanting to sand those air bubbles out. Now I start back down at my sides. Get the corners pushed in. Corners. Get the edges pushed in. Again, any and all excess drippage can be sanded off in the next sanding, which you'll have to do between each coat anyways. So don't fear all kinds of dripping and excess resin. I recommend standing as far back or sitting as far back as you can from your project, only because this stuff is like tar. It doesn't come out very well. I don't think it comes out of clothes at all. If anybody knows how to get resin out of your clothes, please post it. Alright, you'll notice that there's some whiter areas, such as around the pivot point here. Those whiter areas are air bubbles, and air bubbles are not our friend. I may have to sand through them and do separate additions of fiberglass there, but my goal would be in this particular case to get a good run and make sure that I've permeated everything. This is a homemade fiberglass roller made out of a small 3-inch paint roller holder with washers, big and small, and a little push nut on the end. This roller takes and rolls the fiberglass out evenly but with air spaces, allowing it to attach itself without any air bubbles. You always want to roll from the outside, from the inside out, so from the top here down, to eliminate air bubbles throughout the material. There's air bubbles around these pivot points, and that looks pretty good. I'm doing the same thing to this side. You'll notice that the light has changed quite a bit. I'm doing this at night. I don't recommend doing fiberglass work at night anywhere else, but I live in Southern California. It is February 14th of 2012, and the weather out here is beautiful. I will probably have another hour of great weather, and that allows me to get a good setup. And then as this sits overnight, it'll cure, and by the time I've woken up and I'm ready to work on it in the morning, not only will it have cured, but it will be ready to sand and allow me the time to then begin a second layer. It looks pretty ugly, but it's finished. And it'll sit and dry till tomorrow. Okay, now we are clearing and cleaning our fiberglass tools. The number one product you want to use, acetone. Paint thinner does nothing for resin but cause it to just beat up and turn into mush. Again, when you're working with acetone, use gloves. I did not use these gloves for the resin work because just doing that would have caused more sticky issues than what my bare hands could handle. So with the resin now excessed, I can take this excess resin, pour it into a small Dixie cup, and allow it to harden on its own. Make sure that your Dixie cup is made of paper. Resin will burn through plastic. It will burn through styrofoam. So if you're going to use a cup like I have just done for your excess resin, make sure that it is a paper cup, not coated in wax, just a single paper cup. Now I have a bucket full of resin. I have my tool that's covered in resin. If I don't clean these two up, what I wind up with are unusable tools, a junk paintbrush, and a junk fiberglass roller. I do not want to have to go out and buy 100 washers every time I want to do a fiberglass job, so I clean my fiberglass tools so that the next time I use them, they're ready for the process. A little bit more acetone for that cleanup. Notice I cleaned the fiberglass roller first. The reason I do that is because this is the most important tool in my catalog for fiberglass work. If this gets corroded and stiff, I can't break it free, and so I can't use it. And then I get air bubbles, and when you have air bubbles in your fiberglass is worthless. I take the excess, this is now an empty clean can, I take the excess and I clean out my resin mixing bucket. I take and I squeegee as much as I can off of the brush. And then I have to dip a rag in the acetone to clean the brush's handle. This brush got quite a bit of resin on it, on both the handle and, of course, the bristles. So it's important to clean out the bristles as much as possible. Any excess resin is going to harden regardless and cause your brush to be stiff.
A stiff brush is not helpful in the next fiberglass layup. The final product is a wipe down of my resin bucket. Oops, I just spilled. I wipe down my resin bucket. When I'm finished, squeeze out the extra resin. Wipe up any mess that you make, such as what I just did. I store my excess old acetone in an old acetone bottle. And when I get enough of my excess old acetone stored, I take it to the fire department and dispose of it.
Well, it's a new day, and this is the first patch that we did from our following day's work. This is that woven material, that matted fiberglass material. That's a bunch of shards of glass just laid together. I cut it slightly smaller than my patch area so that I could blend it in smoothly to the existing fiberglass section. Today's project is going to basically do the exact same thing we did for this patch. I'm going to take and cut out another piece of this matted up hodgepodge glass stuff. I'm going to lay it out and cut it even smaller than the first patch that I laid in so that that blending can continue from one layer to the next to the next. But before I can do that, I need to sand this particular patch down to rough it up to give the other patch a surface for the resin to etch to then connect from one surface to the next, just as we did with the bondo, layer after layer after layer. On this set of sanding, we're not trying to sand the entire project off. One thing I do want to do is clean up all of this excess resin, so you'll see me sand down here and make sure that none of this exists. But I'm not going to sand back to the bondo. I'm going to sand the topmost layer. And this particular matted up material is probably 4 layers thick. And so you can sand the topmost layer, get it to a place where you've got plenty of connection space, making sure that you pretty much etched everywhere with no dark spots like we did with the bondo, but not trying to sand through any specific spot. The only areas that you really want to sand through and make perfect are your outermost patch places where the matted material is the thinnest. And when you do that, that'll give you that blended smooth feel, that blended smooth look, so that your next patch is just a continuation of what you've done. Then when you put on the overcoat webbing material, the woven fiberglass material, those will both blend just as smoothly. But we'll start off with this matted up material first today, and we're going to do our cutting, and you're going to get to see how to lay the second layer on. You can see that I'm using the DA sander again, not as heavy a grit, not as fast a speed, not as much material removed. I do this because it's important, again, not to remove too much of the material that we've just put on. That's part of our patch. We're just roughing up the surface and getting it ready for the next layer. And the DA sander working in and around the white gel coat that's already in place and hasn't been removed. It doesn't remove enough layers from there to diminish the strength or integrity of those areas, and allows me to remove that excess material that is dripped down all over the side of the keel on both sides. Okay, so I learned my lesson from the last job that I did in the repair. We had a lot of streaks, a lot of excess resin. I figure this time I'll tape off an area just outside of where I'm going to end up sanding anyways. That'll save me from having to gel coat the entire rest of this repaired portion and cut off some of that excess flow of resin. Maybe this will save some time in the next patch time. Okay, so we brought out our fiberglass again. the woven mat material. I have excess from last time. I have the torn apart shards that I pulled out of the edges. Again, I'm saving that for filler material on either later projects or this project. So I'll lay out my sheet here. I'm actually going to take it to the project. And once again, give myself a visual guide and cut out, well, a decent portion. It gives me my patch. It fits pretty well there. Fits pretty well on the back side. And again, this time because I have resin in the plastic below, I'm going to do my pull apart up at the trash can here. So I just want to shred the edges a little bit for quicker molding from one layer to the next and a smoother, nicer finish. Each of these little particles, each of these little what look like strings is glass actually. It's not sharp, horrible, terrible glass until you get the resin on it. And if you get to a place where you've resined up a piece of your project and you have these shards sticking out, it's all dry and done, don't go straight towards the shards with your hands because they will poke right through you just like needles. But in this state it's almost like string. Not something you want to breathe, but something that you can handle, and it doesn't get into you as much as the sanded particles would. Okay, back to mixing and setting up fiberglass resin. Well, first and foremost, gloves. Resin gets really, really sticky. Nobody wants to play with sticky-fingered resin man. The stir stick. Handy-dandy acetone. Your brush is going to have stiff bristles. So a good thing to do before you do your second layer of fiberglass is make sure that your brush's bristles, with a little bit of acetone, are malleable, soft, and pliable, like a paintbrush should be. The excess acetone in the can will come for cleaning of the brush and the roller tool, which you should also soak in a little bit of acetone before the job. The goal would be to have each of those rollers rolling smoothly and clearly before each job. So, I have my resin, I have my catalyst, which is the hardener, I have my bucket. With that particular job, we learned last time that 8 ounces was, or 6 ounces was far too much. We're going to go with the 4 ounce mark. Make sure that we have enough resin for the finalized piece of the project. Alright. So, we're pouring in. And I stop at a little less than 4 ounces. Once again, my resin is clean inside. It's healthy. Gonna set the brush on top. For a little less, or right at about 4 ounces, I'm going to measure out just a little bit of hardener, a little teeny bit more than that. For this particular load, if you were using the small bottles that they give you at the hardware store, probably 10 to 15 drops is a perfect match. I can show you as best I can, but it may not come out well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So I gave it about 20 drops on my own. 15 will give you plenty of time. As somebody who hasn't actually worked with fiberglass often or before, it'll give you plenty of time to get your resin all over your patch project. And you won't have to worry about it hardening up on you inside the bucket here that I'm stirring, or on your brush before you get it to the project. If you had too much hardener, you could have a quick hardening. If you don't put enough hardener in your resin, it just takes a little longer for the project to dry. And that's okay. You have plenty of time to allow it to sit overnight. If you're looking for a rush job, add more hardener. Again, you have the risk of it hardening in the bucket that you're using or before you get it to your project on your brush. But play around with your resin and your hardener mixtures. You'll find out just what you need, and the can itself should explain between 8 and 10 drops per small dosage and per larger dosage, just like you would add salt or pepper to a food product, to the taste, however you feel. So play around with it. I recommend between 10 and 15 drops for about 4 ounces of resin. Okay, I'm back at my project. Again, the reason I have the plastic on the bottom is so that I don't drop my fiberglass onto the dirt, onto the ground. That would defeat the purpose of the project that I'm working on. Something I've noticed is that I didn't give myself quite enough space for my patch material on this far end. So I'm going to take a little bit of my excess and bring it out and put it there. I have a little excess, and I'm going to spread some of it. I'm going to lay it right here. That'll give me that coverage that I was looking for. Plus, there was a dip here, so this gives me some filler for that dip. Well, that's going to be awkward if the wind comes up. I'll take my brush and kind of work on that. Remember what I told you before we actually lay this down. First and foremost, your resin is sticky, but it's important to get a good layer of resin over your patching job. Let's work some resin into this job. This will keep the patching material from blowing away in the wind. As you saw, it's extremely sticky. It also fills in any of the voids that you may have missed bubble-wise on the project that you started with the day before, the under material. On the project you started the day before, the material that happens to be underneath the new layer of fiberglass material. Fill up any of those voids that you see. And like I said, I like to start on the outermost edges. That just gives me the ability to get some of the crazy hair and fur taken care of. Now I move to the opposite side. Yes, you still see bubbles. That's okay for the short term. I got to get the other side glued down. With that done, then I can go back and use my roller and work out all of those bubbles. This is my final matted coat. So I've done as much filling as I can with this matted coat. Before you let the resin harden, you need to take the tape that you put up there to keep the major drips from coming down on the rest of your repair work. You need to take that tape off. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess to try and grind through with the DA sander or with a grinder. So use a small knife or even your fingernail if you can, and peel as much of that tape away as you can. If you can't get it off all the way, you'll notice here that I end up sanding through some of the tape just to get rid of it. It's not a big deal, but you do want to remove as much as you can before the actual resin completely hardens. This is the fiberglass cloth material, different than the fiberglass matte material. As you can see, this is an even woven material, not just layers of shards of glass, but an actual cloth of fiberglass. This is the topping coat that you'll be using on your final portion of your fiberglass repair.